today. I'm the executive director of the New Jersey Council for the Humanities. We are a 501c3 nonprofit organization, and we work across the state of New Jersey, bringing federal funds from the National Endowment for the Humanities to the state, as well as some other funds that we raise locally. We do both some direct programming in communities, and you may see us in your own town, either as a sponsor of events or through programs like Community History or Informed New Jersey. And at the same time, our longest standing and our largest program at NJCH is our grants program. And we are particularly proud of our grants program because we have such remarkable cultural organizations across the state of New Jersey. And it is both a privilege and a pleasure to support those organizations. Our grants program is very competitive because we are so fortunate to have so many wonderful cultural institutions. And every year we are impressed and inspired by what we see coming out of the community. I'm going to turn it over to our program officer, James, who really runs just about everything to do with our grants program and does so very successfully and very knowledgeably. But before I do that for just a second, I'd like to introduce you all to Joseph Samowski, who is our newest staff member at NJCH. Joseph, thank you. Wave to everyone. Joseph is helping us with data collection, with some development efforts, and like everyone on staff, I'm sure he'd be happy to hear from any one of you. So we're delighted to have him with us today, and we're even more delighted to have James here to talk to all of you about applying for an NJCH grant. There is no one who knows the ins and outs of this program better than James, and with that, I will turn it over to him. Please know that if you have any questions during the course of this webinar, you can post them in the chat. I will be monitoring that, so if you post something and we need James to answer a question, I'll jump in and make sure that he knows what you've asked. So feel free to use that. And please keep your mic muted throughout just to keep it easier for everyone to hear. Thanks so much. It's good to have you all here with us today. James, take it away.
All right, great. Thank you, Karen. I appreciate the introduction. Welcome to our Applying for an NJCH Grant workshop. This is a sort of 101 workshop to just kind of discuss some of the basics of our grant making program. Who is eligible to apply? Hold on one second. So today we're going to discuss who can apply. So that's going to cover organization eligibility, what we fund and what we do not fund. So that's going to cover project eligibility. We're going to have a breakdown of our two major grant types. So the incubation grants and the action grants. We'll talk a little bit about how to get started. This is not going to be an in-depth workshop on our application. And then we'll also have some important considerations and dates. We're going to stop throughout to field questions. So if you have any questions, feel free, as Karen said, to put them in the chat. But you can also unmute yourself during the breaks. However, while we're sort of doing the presentation, I'd ask that everyone remain muted. But as you go through, we can stop and you can unmute yourself if you'd like to ask any questions, or as I said, just put them in the chat. So first, we're going to cover who can apply. So New Jersey-based nonprofit organizations or government agencies are eligible to apply. So organizations need to be based in New Jersey. You don't necessarily need to be a 501c3 nonprofit. You could be another type of federally designated nonprofit organization, or perhaps you're registered as a nonprofit through the state of New Jersey, but not through the federal government, or you could be a state, local, county level government agency, whether that's a municipal library, historic society, cultural commission, etc. So I would say if you have any kind of questions about eligibility that might be a little bit less clear cut, definitely feel free to reach out to me. I'll just put this in now. I'll just say this now. The best way to get in touch with me generally is by email. We have a grants@njhumanities.org email address, which I'm going to put into the chat very quickly. That email goes both to myself and also to Gigi Naglak, who is our Director of Programs. So one of us will answer your question as quickly as possible. Typically myself, I run the day-to-day operations of our grants program. Now, one of the requirements that we have, so these are, these grants are what we call like subawards, or we're essentially we re-grant funds from the federal government. So with that, there are some restrictions that come from the National Endowment for the Humanities and apply to federal grants generally that we need to abide by. One of those is that you need to obtain a unique entity identifier, or UEI, from sam.gov. So that will be a requirement by the application deadline. If you're in the process of obtaining the UEI and you haven't quite received it by the application deadline, we can work with you. However, to distribute any funds, we will need to be able to verify that through sam.gov. I will say that the full sam.gov registration is not required. So there's essentially two things you can do. You could either just attain a UEI, because these are, as I said, subawards of federal funds. You don't need the full sam.gov registration. However, if you're ever considering applying for federal grants in the future, say from the National Endowment for the Humanities, National Endowment for the Arts, other federal granting organizations, I would recommend just going through the full registration process. Now, one thing I would like to emphasize is that you do not need to be a humanities-based organization, or a mission organization where your primary mission is, the humanities. And we'll discuss a little bit later what we exactly mean by the humanities, but that is not a strict requirement. We receive awards from, we receive proposals from social service organizations, arts-based organizations, environmental organizations. So a variety of organizations, libraries, which are partly humanities organizations, but do a lot of other work. So we serve a variety of organizations through our grant program. So while you do not need to be a humanities-based organization, we only fund humanities-based projects, and we'll discuss what we exactly mean by that in just a moment. But seeing if anybody has any questions at this moment about organization eligibility before we move on. All right. Okay, so what do we fund? We fund the planning and implementation of public humanities projects. So we do not provide general operating support through our grants. So we fund project-based grants, and they must be public humanities projects. And so I think it'll be helpful to discuss what we mean by the humanities and what we mean by the public humanities. So the humanities would be, I kind of think of them in two different ways. One would be the disciplines and other practices. So disciplines of the humanities, might be things that you're familiar with, your education, history, the study of literature, philosophy, ethics, or practices of the humanities, which would be oral history, textual analysis. So when I mean text, that could mean literature, written text, but also, text, we use the term text broadly. So it could be movies, video games, comic books, television shows, poetry. So we use text broadly, reading and discussion. So these would be sort of humanities-based practices. What we mean by the public humanities is we do not fund projects for scholarly audiences. So we want to make the humanities accessible to broad public audiences. So that's a really important consideration for our grants, is that they are focused on bringing the humanities to the public. So we wouldn't really fund like a scholarly symposium individual scholarly research, etc. If you're interested in those types of grants, I would recommend, like, for example, looking at the NEH and some other organizations as well. There are some, I would say, gray areas in our funding. One that often comes up is the sort of arts and humanities. And I think there's a lot of interesting work in that gray area. I think, kind of where we put the line in the sand, so to speak, is that projects that are purely about the creation and performance of art, self-expression, would not be competitive or perhaps even eligible for our grants. While there is, not a lot of funding for the arts, there's much less funding for the humanities generally, and it's not really our mission to fund arts-based programming. There is a lot of interesting work, though, that kind of at the intersection of the arts and humanities. So I would say that anything is about, the analysis, criticism, interpretation of art would be the humanities, or projects that seek to maybe use artistic practices to explore humanities-based concepts, or you look to utilize the tools of the humanities to create artistic works. Sometimes that can be often more in the planning and development stage. Like, for example, perhaps you want to do a mural about the history of your town, and you need to do some research. So you might be going into the archive, you might be doing oral histories. So that's an example of sort of a more artistically oriented project that we would fund. We wouldn't fund the mural itself, but we could fund the research and planning that, the research and development that goes into doing that historical research to create that mural. We've done sort of similar projects in the past. I think one common area is in theater. We've funded the development of some documentary theater projects. So if you kind of have a project that's in that gray area, definitely feel free to reach out to me, and we can kind of discuss whether our funding is appropriate for your project. So before we move on, do we have any questions? So I have a question. We are headquartered in Philadelphia, but we serve South Jersey. Do we qualify? I know Karin put this in the chat. We could talk a little bit more, one-on-one, but typically no, you need to be a New Jersey-based organization to be able to apply. But we can kind of discuss this if you'd like to discuss this further. Any other questions about either organization eligibility or project eligibility? All right. Okay, what do we not fund? Humanitarian aid and social services, self-help, wellness, health, and fitness programs. I think sometimes people conflate the humanities with benefiting humanity. And while that work is noble and good, it's not something we specifically fund through our programming. Direct political and social advocacy. I think what I mean by that is like projects that, discuss civics or political engagement or, political concepts are fine. It gets more into if you'd want to fund a letter writing campaign to your legislators or a protest. Those are things that we would not fund through our grants. Especially as an organization that regrants federal funds, we need to be careful. That doesn't mean you can't discuss, political, social topics. It's just we don't fund direct advocacy. We need to make that distinction. And just generally projects that do not engage with the humanities, sort of as a broad catch-all. But again, that would be, often is, things such as, purely performing creative arts projects or, things, we get some interesting requests to like funding for a cat shelter, which, again, all well and good. But not something that we would fund. Okay, some questions in the chat. Would a project geared toward New Jersey teachers be considered public? Yes, I think we can kind of discuss a little bit later, but that's one important consideration for our grants is knowing who your audience is and being specific. I think that if it's kind of geared towards like specific teachers in a specific school district, like it's like a professional development program for teachers in a school district, that's not going to be a really competitive grant. For I'd say any projects that are based in academic institutions, we're looking for sort of broader public engagement. But there are many projects that we work with that involve New Jersey teachers, for example, curriculum development projects that often takes the form in like forming advisory committees made up of teachers from throughout the state to advise different organizations who want to create curriculum, on how that would sort of best be utilized in the classroom, kind of as a sort of proxy for understanding the needs and interests of the students that the curriculum is looking to serve. Any other questions before we move on? Yeah, that's a good distinction. So I like what Karin says here. No project will ever touch all sectors of the public at once. So I think you just have to make the case that a program for New Jersey teachers is likely to have an impact on NJ communities. Yeah, that's part of it too, is that, when we say public audience, we don't necessarily mean the broadest public audience possible. Sometimes the most impactful projects might serve a kind of slightly more limited, it's not serving everyone in the public, but we're sort of looking towards publicly oriented projects rather than projects that are geared towards, academics and more specialist audiences. So that's kind of what we mean by public humanities. And if you have any specific questions too, we can kind of discuss that. Sometimes I think it helps to think about how to kind of thinking of different tier audiences, like maybe the first order audiences, the first tier of audience would be teachers, the second, tier might be students, et cetera. So sometimes like you might be looking to serve like one audience as your primary audience, but you might have like a secondary or tertiary audience that you're considering as well through your programming. And, this is something too, we'll get to this later, but we do offer the ability for organizations to schedule one-to-one meetings, typically with myself. And if you kind of have some of these more specific questions about how to make your grant competitive, we can discuss that in more detail one-on-one. And I'd be happy to do that. And I'll definitely put some information in later to kind of discuss how you could do that. All right, so we have two primary grant types, incubation grants and action grants. So incubation grants support the planning, development of new projects or the reimagining of existing programs. Maybe you have a long-running program that's gotten a little bit stale, you're not reaching the audiences that you want, and you kind of want to, focus on how you could, audience development, researching new content. Maybe you need to update some of the information on it. So reimagining some of your programming, whether that's like an exhibit, a reading and discussion series, et cetera. Those are all sort of uses for the incubation grant. Action grants are focused on either the implementation of public humanities projects or their expansion. And I think one thing to note is that even a new project would be suitable for an action grant if you kind of have a very clear idea of what you want to do. So maybe perhaps you've already done a planning process and you kind of have a clear idea of, what the program is looking to accomplish, who the audience or audiences are, all the key players, a clear timeline for implementation. It's focused on primarily events, and we say events broadly. It doesn't necessarily need to be in-person events, but I guess events and programs, broadly speaking, would be appropriate, whether that's, in-person events, hybrid events, digital resources. Perhaps you want to publish like a digital exhibit. You've already completed all the planning. An action grant would be appropriate, even if it's sort of brand new to you. If you already finished the planning process. The incubation is kind of a little bit more like, maybe you have a lot of unanswered questions that you need to consider. And I think that's what makes a really strong incubation grant is like, what are the questions that you have as an organization about your project that you need to answer before you can fully implement it? An incubation grant is not really going to be focused on programming. There can be some like limited programming in, but if it's programming is the main focus, and even if you have some limited programming, it really should be more about like the assessment of like, okay, how can we approve this through an iterative process? Maybe we need to do some user testing, et cetera. It's not really going to be focused on like broad implementation and expansion, or you're even limited. As I said, you can work towards a more limited audience. So you cannot apply for both grants. So you can only apply for one grant per round. Organizations are only eligible to have one open action or incubation grant at a time. And you cannot apply for both throughout the rounds. However, you can switch before the application deadline. So for example, perhaps, you begin the application process, you're going to apply for an action grant, and perhaps, throughout the process, you realize, we have a lot of unanswered questions. We're not really sure, who this is supposed to serve. We don't have, a really clear idea of what the content of this, this project is going to be. We need to take some time for planning. So you can switch if that's the case. Sometimes this happens. Usually probably like 2 or 3 people would switch per round. After they do discussion with either with myself or we do draft review. And you decide, you're like, what, I'm not really ready to, this grant is more appropriate for the project that I want to fund. And you can also too, if you want to like schedule a meeting beforehand, kind of discuss your options and try to get a sense of what would be the best fit for your project. Definitely happy to do that. So before we move on, any questions, feel free to put them in the chat or unmute yourself. Katie asked a great question. Is it typical for organizations to apply for incubation in the first year, then apply for action in the following years or years forward to move that development forward? Yeah, that we have instances of that, where organizations will, plan their programming through an incubation grant. And then once that is complete, apply for the action grant for the implementation. We've also had instances where organizations have applied for an incubation grant, and then applied for another one because after that they still had a lot of unanswered questions for perhaps for some of the more complex projects that is usually like incubation to action. One incubation then an action grant is more common, but I've seen different iterations of it as well. But if you're already kind of ready, you don't need to apply for an incubation grant first. I think a lot of people, that's a common misconception, is that organizations have to apply for an incubation grant the first time they apply. That is not the case. If you're very clear on kind of the project and it's going to be really focused on implementation, you should apply for an action grant. Another question, would the continuation expansion of a previously funded NJCH Action Grant be considered? Yes, so we don't have a limit on that. Organizations are eligible to reapply for existing programs, and you don't necessarily need to take a year off. So that's, yeah, you're definitely welcome to do that, Amy. All right, any other questions before I move on? You're welcome, Amy. Great to see you here. All right, getting started. I can't emphasize this enough. I would highly recommend you should read the guidelines. It is, I can't force you to read the guidelines, but we have a lot of information, important information in our grant guidelines. So this link, njhumanities.org/grants, will take you to the grants overview page, which will kind of go into like a very basic, getting started kind of rundown, some broad information about our grants. From there, you can link to either the action or the incubation grants. The action and incubation grants, the guidelines are relatively similar. The only section that is really substantially different is the eligible projects section, which kind of breaks down what kind of specific projects would be appropriate for an action grant or an incubation grant. Can't emphasize it enough. Read the guidelines. They're available 24/7. Spend a lot of time on them, but also, have had organizations not receive funding because they didn't read the guidelines, and they requested funding for ineligible expenses, like $10,000 for landscaping, which we did not fund. So it's really important. I definitely would recommend reading through that, making understanding, what you can and cannot request funding for. The next step is to go to our online grant application and management system. If you go to njhumanities.org/portal, that will take you there. You can also, from the grants page, Incubation and Action Grant pages, will link to our application system. If you've not applied in the past, you will need to register your organization. If you have any challenges with that, please let me know, or you're unsure if you've previously registered. If you haven't applied for a grant since, if you've applied before, but maybe it was before, before 2020, you probably would need to register your organization, since that's when we got this new system. The next step is to submit an LOI. So you'll need to choose the Action Grant LOI or the Incubation Grant LOI. The LOI is required, but not competitive. So LOI means a letter of intent, but it's not really a letter. It's a form in our online system. It's just going to ask some basic questions, what your project name is going to be. That's for internal really use only at this moment. So, you can change it before the deadline if you like. It's going to ask for an estimated request. So between $2,000 to $15,000, that's the span of our grants. You can change that too throughout this application cycle. So maybe partway through, you're like, I don't, as you kind of refine your budget, you might say, oh, I need a little bit less or a little bit more. That just helps us plan and kind of see what the round is looking like. It's going to ask for a very short project description. Again, at this moment, it's going to be something that's mainly internal. We're just trying to see if there's a humanities project in there somewhere. If we have any questions about it, where it's unclear, we'll definitely follow up with you. You don't need to, you can schedule a call before you submit an LOI, but it's not required either. So the LOI is required, but it's not a competitive process. We just really at this point are seeing, is your organization eligible and is your project eligible in the kind of broadest sense possible? And we kind of refine from there. So I see one question in the chat. I'm going to take one sip of water really quick.
James, it wasn't a question. It was me just saying that the LOI form is short and people should find it simple. Don't overthink it. That was all.
Yeah. It's really short. These are really short, simple questions. We're going to ask, again, short project description, your organization's mission and audience. You can, if you have a mission statement, you can literally put that, copy it in there, just a kind of brief description of the audiences you serve. And again, like this doesn't really need to be polished at this point. We are going to, you'll have another, month or so to kind of, refine your responses. So the LOI submission opens today. So we accept and approve LOIs on a rolling basis throughout March. We typically, approve them within 24 hours. Sometimes we might need a little bit more time. But, if you submit it today, there's a high chance that I will either approve it today or tomorrow. So you don't need to it's not going to be a situation where, you submit the LOI today and we approve it on March 31st. So definitely, or you could submit it March 30th. So anytime between March 1st and March 31st, you can submit the LOI and we kind of will approve it on a rolling basis throughout that period. All right. Okay, so these are some important considerations. So as I mentioned before, these are project grants. They're not GOS grants. I know sometimes this can be a challenge for organizations where essentially their programming is their mission. It's so directly connected to it. And I think often this gets into a question of framing and also how you structure the budget. And that's something I can help you with if that is the circumstances that you find yourself in, where there's not really a clear delineation between, the programming that you want to fund and the kind of mission of your organization. There are some ineligible requests. There's a list in the grant guidelines, but for example, we can't fund fundraising, as one cost, or if you want to put a new roof on your building, that's not something else we would fund either. So yeah, these are for kind of more project-oriented grants within a specific time frame. These are matching grants, so there's a one-to-one matching requirement. How the match can be either cash or in kind. So cash would be money from your organization's general operating budget, which would include things such as staff salaries, which you can use. You can either request through the grant itself, so you can use the grant to underwrite staff salaries through the request, or you could use those, for example, to help meet your match, for the time that you're dedicating towards this project. Could also be in kind. So, for example, you might be entirely a volunteer-run organization. You can actually use the grant funds to compensate volunteers, but perhaps you need, you primarily need to use the funds for other sources, and you want to use, the estimated value of your volunteer time as the way to make your match. So yeah, match can be either cash or in kind. So it said donated goods and services. We recommend that you use the independent sector evaluation for the value of volunteer time, which is $30 an hour. Roughly. So I actually have a link to that in the grant application itself, in the section that explains matching funds. So project period. So we're going to be announcing our funding decisions at the end of June. These grants can last up to 1 year. They can begin between July 1st, 2023 to September 30th, 2023, and last for a period of up to 1 year. One thing that's important to keep in mind is that you can only incur costs towards the grants within the grant period. So if there's going to be expenses that you have incurred before the grant period or after the grant period, you cannot include them in the grant itself. But so it only need to be, that includes the match as well. So the matching expenses need to be within the grant period. One thing that I would keep in mind, if you have a kind of multi-year project, this is something, perhaps you're thinking of a project that's going to take span over 2, 3, 4 plus years. I would say it's important to kind of time bound what you're describing. One thing I see applicants do is that they might have a multi-year project and they describe the 5 years of what they're going to do, but it's not really clear what they're going to do within the next year. So it can be important to kind of provide that 5-year picture to give some context around it, but the primary focus of the narrative and the budget should be what do you want to do in the next year to move this project forward. And that's something I can just can discuss with you as well, one-to-one, if you kind of have specific questions about how to go about doing that. Also the project team. So if you've applied for our grants in the past, we used to have, what we say was like the Humanities scholar requirement. We've kind of since changed that. So we're really looking to see, how the project team, their skills, experience, et cetera, complement each other holistically. So perhaps you might have somebody, you're doing a history-based project, you have someone who's a subject matter expert, but you also want to do oral histories. And, perhaps the historian of that time period doesn't really have a lot of experience doing oral histories. So you might have somebody else doing oral histories, or, perhaps one person is doing, audience engagement. They're really skilled at that. And somebody else is working on kind of more of the, content elements of the project. So we're really looking to see how people kind of work together holistically. Project team members can be, this is really people who are kind of deeply involved in the project over the lifespan of your period. So it would be less like somebody who's doing a one-off presentation and more somebody who's involved with the project throughout the lifespan. That can be either internal to your organization, could also be, external, consultants, et cetera, that you bring in to your project. We don't require that project team members have like PhDs, for example. So we have a kind of broad definition of what we would consider, different types of people that would be, appropriate for your project team members, which would be, your traditional academic, practitioners who might, teach or be researchers at universities, colleges, could be public humanists who, may or may not have advanced training, but, primarily work at, museums, libraries, other nonprofit organizations, historical societies, and then also like, kind of like, what we might consider like, some more like non-traditional scholars, like maybe somebody who, they may or may not have, formal education, but is considered by the community as a bearer of knowledge. So we have kind of longer definitions of that on our website, but just kind of emphasizing that, to be a member of the project team, it's just somebody who's kind of contributing, and making a substantial contribution to the project over the long term. And I say more of the like the content, audience development, et cetera, rather than, somebody who's doing the finances. So that's kind of where we're looking at the project team members. And if you kind of have any questions about that, I would be happy to, either discuss that now, or we could discuss that one-on-one. We also will help you find people if you need it. So maybe, you have somebody in your organization who, has, one particular skill, but, you need to outsource other elements of the project. We can help you kind of identify somebody that's appropriate. So before I move on, does anybody have any questions?
Hi, James. It's Natalie from Hunterdon County. Thank you so much for doing this presentation. This has been very helpful so far. You can tell me if this would end up being a one-on-one question, but as a unit of county government, we're looking with this grant funding to hire outside help for our project. But I would not be able to name that specific person because we have to go to bid and whatnot. So it would have to be like, here's the grant funding that we have available, or the funding that we have available, and then go through our process. So what do I do?
Well, that's a great question. So one thing I like to kind of, so going back to our two different, this is going to be kind of a longer response. So one thing, if you're applying for an incubation grant, part of the process can be identifying project team members. So if you don't have specific people named, you could say, what are the skills, experience that we're looking for? What's the process we would go to identify them? And I think if I'm remembering correctly, you were interested in applying for an action grant. I mean, I would say that, are there other people like involved in the project that would, maybe that one element is not really, quite ready by the time you submit the application, but you probably have other people that you could also include as like project team members who've been involved in the kind of planning and development of the project so far. So those could also be considered, members of the project team, even if perhaps like a lot of their contribution happened before the actual grant period itself. And that's going to affect, the budget and what you could request money for. But, perhaps they made a substantial contribution before the grant period. You can kind of discuss the kind of contribution that you've made. And we can also, even if you're kind of going through the process of that, and applying for an action grant, we can kind of discuss that in a little bit more detail. So, but you could also discuss, in the application of like what you're looking for in this person, the skills and experience, and kind of also, kind of explaining your circumstances as well. Because I understand that you, as a unit of county government have some restrictions on the organization and the processes that you need to adhere to. Yes, Karen is raising her hand.
I just had an additional thought to supplement what you're saying, James, which is that when you submit your application, the other thing you could do is include among supplemental materials an RFP or a job description for that person that you plan to bring in. And that would be a great way of signaling that you know what you're looking for. You could even include a list of places where you intend to post it, so that I think the reviewers want to see that this isn't, sort of a vague concept in your head, but if you can show them, we're going to use this funding to bring in this kind of a person, we have a clear idea of what we're looking for, and we know exactly where to go to advertise this kind of a post. I think then not having a specific name is just fine. So, just to kind of build on what James is saying, there are spaces in the application where you can make it clear that you know what you're doing, even though you may not have that name or that person on board yet for very, important reasons. You wouldn't be able to hire it until you were sure you got the funding anyway, or whatever. So, just an additional thought.
Thank you, Karen. That's a good suggestion. All right, any other questions? So next, I wanted to highlight some of our, what we call maybe grant adjacent programs. So that would be community history, sponsorships, and humanities lab. So I'm not going to go into great detail about these, but these might, for example, for the community history program is really designed for organizations that want to do public history based work, incorporate history into their organization, perhaps that don't have any prior experience, or it can also be a good fit for, I'd say, like non-professionalized history based organizations, like a volunteer historical society, which has a lot of dedicated volunteers, but perhaps they're not trained historians. So it's going to be training in the practices of public history. This is not a grant program. This is a series of intensive workshops. You're going to be paired together with a cohort and do a lot of kind of intense learning, have one-on-one mentorship. There's a small award attached to do kind of a pilot project, but it's much smaller than what you would get through our grant program. We also have our sponsorships program. This is geared towards, I'd say, if you have a kind of probably more towards like one-off, high profile events that might not really be as a good fit for our funding. So perhaps you want to do like a workshop or, a conference or something of that nature, or like a high profile like speaker. So those are kind of often geared towards like public events and where there's like significant opportunity for visibility, etc. And we're also starting our Humanities Lab, which is a very new program that we're doing this year, which is almost like a pre-incubation grant. Again, it's going to be similar to community history, where it's going to be a series of workshops where you learn about, basically you're going to learn how to kind of create a different kind of humanities programs models. This perhaps like you have no experience in doing public humanities work, and you feel like even applying for an incubation grant might be too daunting. You're really not even really sure where to begin. The Humanities Lab might be a great fit for you. We have some information on our website. So you go to njhumanities.org. Underneath the programs tab, you'll find descriptions of these programs. So, perhaps the grant might not be, the best fit for you. So these are some other options that you can consider looking into. If you're looking to support particularly, the community history, Humanities Lab would be great spots if you're kind of, really getting started with this kind of work and not really sure even where to begin. So those are kind of more focused on, one-on-one mentorship and skill training rather than, designing your own program from the ground up. You're going to have a lot more input and assistance in those programs. Karen, is there anything you'd like to add about these? Or
no, just stay tuned to our website for developments on some of it. The Humanities Lab, there's going to be a lot of material forthcoming. And I think all three programs offer really exciting opportunities that sit right next to grants so that, they give organizations opportunities to learn or to receive smaller pots of funding, which helps us, spread things out a little more, since, as I said at the beginning, our grants program is pretty competitive. So it just helps us make sure that we spread our funding as widely as we can.
Absolutely. Anybody have any questions? All right, so I want to go over some important dates. The LOI period, as I mentioned before, it's between March 1st and March 31st. The deadline for LOI submission is March 31st at 11:59 p.m. So one thing I'd say is that all the deadlines, it's just 11:59 p.m. of that day. We are also offering organizations the ability to do draft review. The deadline for draft review is April 10th at 11:59 p.m. It could be either written feedback or it could be part of like a scheduled meeting. There will be some, because of the kind of time period between the draft review deadline and the final deadline. If you want to have a meeting to discuss your draft, I would definitely recommend submitting earlier, because the closer we get to the deadline, it'll just be more difficult for, to kind of have the turnaround between reviewing drafts and, scheduling a one-on-one meeting with you and your other members of your organization. And so while these are the deadlines, you could submit, earlier. So for example, perhaps, you submit the LOI earlier, you submit the draft earlier. That's always an option as well. The final application deadline is Tuesday, April 18th at 11:59 p.m. again. And then we will notify all applicants of our decision, whether you're awarded or not, by June 30th, 2023. And as I said, this is for projects that begin between July 1st and September 30th, 2023. If you are not funded, we do provide feedback on your proposal, and that feedback can be either, again, through a meeting, or we also could send you written feedback as well. So our grants are reviewed by members of our grants review committee, which is made up of members of our board of trustees and external evaluators. The external evaluators are humanities professionals throughout New Jersey who work at museums, libraries, universities, other nonprofit organizations. They tend to be, more practitioners than academics. So in the feedback that we pass along will be feedback from their proposal. Proposals are reviewed by 5 evaluators, and typically how we, so they read, review, and then we meet and they discuss the decisions. That's how we make our funding decisions. So kind of just be a little transparent about kind of how that goes forward. Also have some upcoming workshops. So next week we have, this is not really quite a grant related program, but can be useful for perhaps somebody in your organization. It's the nonprofit finance for the accidental accountant. That's on March 9th from 10 to 2 p.m. That is in person only. It's at the Hickory Corner Library, which is part of the Mercer County Library System. Yeah, that's going to be presented by we work with your part-time controller, and our controller is going to be doing a presentation, kind of running through the basics of accounting. So, this is going to be, if you have a CPA, it's not for you, but if you kind of find yourself in the situation of like, where you're, as it often is at nonprofits, small organizations, you might find yourself in a role that you're not really prepared for. For example, I've become the accidental techie, because I fixed a printer once.
Roles sometimes that you're not prepared for, because that's how nonprofits work, right? So
yeah,
all of us at tiny nonprofits do 15 different jobs in any given day. And just to put an extra plug for this, Claire, who's our controller, Claire Shuley, is fantastic. So she makes it a lot simpler than it otherwise seems.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, if you're interested in accounting, or you find yourself in the situation of being the accidental accountant, highly recommend it. We also are having this is grant related. It's creating an outstanding proposal on April 4th from 2 to 3 p.m. I'm going to be kind of giving a breakdown of our application. So we're going to be kind of going more in depth about what's in the application and some considerations to make your proposal more competitive. And then I guess I have this a little out of order. On March 16th from 12 to 1 p.m. we're going to have a Introducing Humanities Lab workshop on March 16th from 12 to 1 p.m. If you're all these will require registration. So if you go to our website and go to our events page, you can find links to all of these to register. And if you're applying for a grant, I will be sending you a registration link for the Creating an Outstanding Proposal workshop in your LOI acceptance emails. That will all include information too, for example, like how to submit your draft proposal, etc. And with that, I am finished. So if you need help, always here, happy to help you. It's my job, so don't ever feel shy in asking me for assistance. That's what I'm here for. So as I said, my name is James Kirkland. I'm a program officer. Grants at njhumanities.org is the best email to reach out to me by. It goes to both Gigi and I. Gigi is the director of programs who was not able to attend today. And I will typically respond, but if I'm off or otherwise busy, Gigi monitors that email account as well and will respond also. 609-695-4303 is my direct line. If you kind of have like simple function, quick questions and just want to call, it's not like really necessary to schedule a meeting. If you want to just hop on the phone and be like, hey, I can't figure out how to register for this account, or I'm having this kind of this minor error. I would say that if you want to have like a more in-depth discussion that might require some more preparation on my end, we could schedule a meeting. I will, if you submit an LOI, I'll include instructions on how to schedule a meeting with me, or you could just send an email to grants@njhumanities.org, and I will send you a link to schedule a meeting directly with me. And then also njhumanities.org/grants. That is available 24/7 and is a great resource on how to apply for our grants. So with that, that is the presentation for today. I'm going to stop sharing and I'll be available for any questions that you might have. Unless I did such a great job, nobody has any questions. You're welcome.
Oh, I have a question. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to ruin that for you.
Oh, no. I'm definitely here for questions. So.
Okay, so I guess like when we're talking about grant amounts, right? So we have our request.
Mhm.
And this is my first rodeo here. So, is this like kind of an all or nothing thing, or do you do partial funding?
That's a good question. So we occasionally will do partial funding. It is our preference not to do partial funding, but we do on occasion. That could be for, as I said, our grants are very competitive. So sometimes we might award partial funding just so we can distribute more funds out to people. Or sometimes there might be like an eligible expense in an otherwise, good proposal. So we might just like zero that out. And award the rest of the funds, but it's we would prefer to award full funding in most cases, because if you're requesting, we're always very cognizant of the fact that if you request $15,000 and we record you $12,000, we award you $12,000, that's going to impact your ability to sort of implement the project. So yeah, I guess the question, there's not. Our preference is not to, but we do on occasion, just because like our grants are so competitive, and sometimes it just helps us, award more funds throughout the state to more organizations. Any other questions? And if we do award partial funding, it's going to be like 80 to 90%. It's not going to be like a 50% award. You're welcome, Noreen. Thank you for joining us. You're welcome, Kelly. All right, I'm going to stop recording. I'm going to stick around